All right, the popularity of DNA-driven genealogy services has led to some headline-grabbing discoveries as people investigating their roots have uncovered family secrets, found long-lost relatives, and even helped solve a cold case. Well, now a curious woman in California.
There is a photograph. It is black and white, printed in a newspaper from 1951. In it, two boys stand together, one older, one younger. The younger one is 6 years old. He is small. He is smiling. And within days of that photograph being taken, he will be gone. Not missing in the way that cases sometimes go. Not wandered off, not lost in the woods, not found the next morning. Gone. Completely. Surgically. As if someone had reached into the fabric of a family's ordinary Tuesday afternoon and pulled a thread and the whole thing unraveled. For 73 years, that boy was gone. And then, in 2024, he wasn't. Quick question before we continue. Are you one of those people who listens to true crime while cooking, driving, cleaning, or are you fully locked in, lights dimmed, volume up? Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I want to know who's staying up way too late solving mysteries with me. If you're enjoying this deep dive, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more real cases every week. There is something that needs to be understood before going further. This is not a cold case in the traditional sense, not a murder, not a disappearance that ended in tragedy. What this case represents is something far rarer and in some ways even more disorienting. It is the story of a boy who was taken, who lived an entire life without knowing who he truly was. A man who raised children, served his country, fought in a war, retired, grew old, all while somewhere across the country, a mother walked into a police station every single year to ask the same question, and every year received the same hollow answer. No leads. Nothing. Luis Armando Albino was just 6 years old when he was kidnapped from the Oakland park, where he had been playing with his older brother, lured by a woman who promised to buy him candy. That is the bare fact of it. A child, a park, a promise of something sweet, and then nothing. But the nothing is where this story truly begins. To understand what happened on the 21st of February 1951, you have to understand where the Albino family was at that moment in their lives. Albino was born in Puerto Rico and had been brought to the U.S. by his parents, with his 5 siblings, in the summer of 1950. Think about that timeline. The family had only been in California for a matter of months. They had crossed an ocean, settled into the unfamiliar rhythms of West Oakland, and were still finding their footing in a new country, a new language, a new world. Life in California was challenging. Their mother, Antonia, worked 2 jobs, day and night. She was, by every account, a woman of enormous resolve. She had uprooted her family, crossed from Puerto Rico, and planted them in American soil, not because it was easy, but because she believed in something better for her children. 6 children, 2 jobs, a new country, and a 6-year-old boy who loved to play in the park. Luis Armando Albino was 6 years old when he was playing at Jefferson Square Park at 7th Street and what is now Martin Luther King Jr. Way with his older brother Roger on the 21st of February 1951. Jefferson Square Park. That name matters. It is a real place. A public space in the heart of West Oakland. The kind of neighborhood park where children run and shout and exist in the uncomplicated joy of being small. Roger was 10 years old. Luis was 6. 4 years between them, old enough that Roger could watch his brother, young enough that neither of them could have understood what was about to happen. Albino's older brother Roger was with him at the time, but he turned his back long enough for the stranger to lure Albino away with the promise of candy. That is the moment. One turn back. One brief distraction. One stranger with a promise. And when Roger turned around again, his little brother was gone. What Roger Albino reported to authorities that day was precise and consistent. A woman, a bandana around her head. She had spoken to Luis in Spanish in his own language, the language of home, and promised to take him to a nearby store to buy him candy. Luis left the park with a woman wearing a bandana who spoke to him in Spanish, according to his then 10-year-old brother. Stop and sit with that detail for a moment. She spoke to him in Spanish in 1951. The Albino family had only been in America for a matter of months. Luis, at 6 years old, almost certainly could not yet speak English fluently. He was still inside the world of his first language, still operating in the familiar sounds of Puerto Rico. And this woman, whoever she was, knew that. She approached him in the language he trusted, in the language that meant safety, meant home, meant mother. That is not a random act. That is deliberate. That is premeditated. Someone who knew something about this family, or at minimum, someone who was watching, who understood the vulnerability of a small Spanish-speaking child in an English-speaking city, and exploited it with calculation. Roger reported what he saw, and then began a nightmare that would last 7 decades. Oakland Tribune articles from the time reported police, soldiers from a local army base, the Coast Guard, and other city employees joined a massive search for the missing boy. San Francisco Bay and other waterways were also searched. This was not a small response. In 1951, law enforcement mobilized significantly. The Army, the Coast Guard, multiple agencies. The waters of the San Francisco Bay were physically searched. Boats, personnel, resources. Oakland police did not simply take a report and file it away. They searched and they found nothing. Not a trace. Not a witness beyond Roger. Not a scrap of evidence pointing in any direction. A 6-year-old boy had walked out of Jefferson Square Park with a stranger, and the earth had simply swallowed him whole. The Coast Guard was dispatched to search the waters around Jack London Square, but turned up nothing. San Francisco Bay and several other bodies of water were also searched. State and federal authorities uncovered no leads during their initial investigations. The fact that the search extended to water is telling. In 1951, when a small child vanished without explanation, investigators considered the worst possibilities first. An accident, a drowning, a tragedy that might yet be found. The instinct was to search for remains. Not because anyone wanted that outcome, but because at least it would be an answer. There were no remains. There was no answer. His brother, Roger Albino, was interrogated several times by investigators, but stood by his story about a woman with a bandana around her head taking his brother. Interrogated several times. A 10-year-old boy was brought in, questioned repeatedly, pressed, and he never changed his account. Not once. Whatever happened in those interrogation rooms, Roger Albino held to the truth of what he had witnessed. A woman with a bandana. She spoke Spanish. She took Luis. That was what he had seen. And that was what he said, over and over again, to investigators who perhaps found it difficult to build a case from the account of a grieving 10-year-old. Antonia Albino did not stop. That needs to be understood clearly, because it becomes the backbone of everything that happens decades later. Antonia continued to pressure authorities and visited the police's missing person bureau almost daily at first, then weekly, then monthly, and eventually annually. Daily, then weekly, then monthly, then once a year. Imagine mapping out that descent. The urgency of daily visits, the raw, fresh terror of a mother who cannot stop moving, because to stop is to accept the unacceptable. And then, slowly, as the months wore into years, as the years wore into decades. Those visits became a kind of ritual, not because the hope had died, but because the calendar of grief had stretched so far that a mother who once showed up every morning was now marking a single day each year to walk back into a police building and ask the same question she had always asked. She was often attended by a neighbor or one of her older children, as she did not speak English. She needed someone to translate for her. She was standing in a foreign country, in a language she did not speak, at a desk staffed by strangers, asking about a boy who had been swallowed by America, and she kept showing up. Luis's mother never left home without the newspaper clipping first announcing the kidnapping in her wallet. She carried the clipping with her every day. Every single day. For decades. The original article, the one published when the story was fresh, when Luis was still possibly findable, when the world still might have known something, she kept it folded in her wallet. It is the kind of detail that tells you everything about a person, without needing any further explanation. 15 years passed. The family renewed their search 15 years after the kidnapping, when Albino would have been 21, SF Gate reported. They made multiple trips to Puerto Rico, where Antonia suspected her son had been taken, but turned up nothing. This is a crucial inflection point. By 1966, Luis would have been 21. Old enough, perhaps, to be on official records. Old enough to have enlisted in military service, to have a driver's license, to appear somewhere in the documentation of adult American life. The family reasoned that if he was alive, he might now be findable through official channels. And Antonia's theory that her son had been taken back to Puerto Rico led them to make multiple transatlantic searches. They found nothing. And in 1966, an Oakland police investigator named Lou Teat, Dominic DeFryer, said something to the Oakland Tribune that has lingered in the history of this case like smoke. This is a rare situation when a boy disappears and doesn't eventually show up alive or dead. He told the Oakland Tribune in 1966, "I'd give an awful lot to find out why." Read that again. A seasoned investigator, 15 years into a case that had produced zero answers, saying that even the absence of a body was unusual. In most cases, even the darkest ones, something surfaces eventually. Evidence remains. A witness, a deathbed confession, something. But Luis Albino had produced nothing. Nobody meant the investigation could not close in the tragic but final way that at least provides clarity. No leads meant the case could not move forward. It simply hung there, open and unresolvable, for decade after decade after decade. Here is the question that haunts the middle years of this story, the years between 1951 and 2020, when this case existed in a kind of suspended silence. Where was Luis? Not where was he hiding, not where had he gone, but where was he living? Who did he think he was? What name did he answer to when someone called out to him? What did he believe about his parents, his family, his origin? The answers to those questions are still not fully public. All information about Luis's life is a bit uncertain. It is unknown if he lived with the woman who kidnapped him, if he had the same name his whole life, or if he knew he had family searching for him all these years. But what is known, and what is extraordinary, is this. The boy who was taken from a park in West Oakland grew up. He grew up on the East Coast of the United States. He went to school, presumably, and learned English, if he hadn't already begun to learn it. He became a young man, and that young man made choices about his life that tell us something remarkable about who Luis Albino became. He worked as a firefighter and served 2 tours in Vietnam in the Marine Corps. He had both children and grandchildren by the time he was reunited with his birth family. A firefighter, a Marine, 2 tours in Vietnam, children, grandchildren. The boy who disappeared from Jefferson Square Park in 1951 had become a man who ran toward danger for a living. first in a war zone, then in a firehouse. He had built a life, a career, a family. He was woven into the fabric of wherever he lived on the East Coast, deeply and genuinely. And for all of those decades, all of those years of building and living and serving, he believed he was someone else's son. He spent most of his life believing he was the son of another couple. And so the central mystery deepens. Because a man who believed he was someone else's son is not a man who was necessarily told the truth. He was a man who had been handed a story about himself, a story about who his parents were, where he came from, how he arrived in this world, and had lived inside that story entirely for nearly 8 decades. He had sent his children to school carrying that story. He had filled out forms and applications carrying that story. He had stood at military ceremonies and retirement parties and family dinners carrying that story. None of it was true. Now consider what he did know, because this is where the case takes on a texture that is difficult to fully comprehend. He has some memory of the abduction and his cross-country trip, but had never gotten answers from the adults in his life. He remembered. Not completely, he was 6 years old, and the mind of a 6-year-old does not preserve every detail with the clarity of a film camera. But he remembered something. He remembered enough. And at some point in his childhood, or his adolescence, or his young adult life, he must have asked. He must have looked at the adults around him and said, I remember traveling. I remember something before this. What happened? Where did I come from? And the adults in his life gave him nothing. That silence, the silence of the people who raised him, who presumably knew the truth of what had happened, is itself one of the most significant unanswered questions in this entire case. What did they know? What did they say? Did they tell him he was imagining things? Did they change the subject? Did they offer some version of an explanation that was just plausible enough to quiet him without ever being honest? We don't know. Luis Albino has chosen not to speak publicly about his experience. And that choice, that deliberate, considered privacy, belongs entirely to him. The year is 2020. The place is Oakland, California. A 63-year-old woman named Alida Aliquin is sitting somewhere with her phone or her laptop, about to do something that will 4 years later change the course of this story entirely. She takes a DNA test. She took an online DNA test in 2020, just for fun, as she told the Mercury News. Just for fun. That phrase is worth pausing on, not as part of an investigation, not with a specific goal or hypothesis in mind. She didn't sit down at her computer thinking she was about to crack open a 70-year-old kidnapping case. She took a DNA test the way millions of people have taken DNA tests in the modern era, out of curiosity, out of a vague interest in ancestry, out of the simple human desire to understand where we come from. Alida Aliquin is the niece of Luis Armando Albino. She had grown up knowing she had a missing uncle. The family talked about him. His photo hung at relatives' houses. Her grandmother had carried a newspaper clipping about his abduction in her wallet every day until she died. Luis was not a forgotten name in this family. He was a presence. An absence that was present, if that makes sense. A person-shaped hole in the family that everyone knew about, that everyone carried, that no one had ever been able to fill. Among the results was a 22% match with a man she had never met. The Oakland resident reached out to him, but didn't hear back or pursue it further until earlier this year, when she watched a documentary that inspired her to renew her search. A 22% match. Significant enough to indicate a close biological relationship, an uncle, potentially, but not definitive enough to be certain. And the man she matched with did not respond to her outreach, which is itself interesting. Either he didn't see the message, or he chose not to respond, or he had reasons of his own to maintain distance from an unexpected DNA relative. But at the time, without confirmation, without more information, Aliquin did not push further. The lead sat dormant for 4 years. Something shifted in early 2024. Aliquin watched a documentary. The specific one has not been publicly identified, but the effect is documented. In early 2024, she and her daughters began searching again. Something in what she watched reignited the question her grandmother had carried in her wallet. And this time, Aliquin brought her daughters along. This became a family project, 3 generations of women, sitting together, opening up browser tabs, pulling up genealogy records, cross-referencing what the DNA test had told them years before. And then came the library. On a visit to the Oakland Public Library, she looked at microfilm of Tribune articles, including one that had a picture of Luis and Roger, which convinced her that she was on the right track. Microfilm. That old technology, those rolls of photographically preserved newspaper pages that libraries maintain for exactly these kinds of archival moments. Aliquin sat down at a reader and scrolled through decades-old Oakland Tribune issues until she found it. A photograph of 2 brothers, Luis and Roger, published in 1951, when the kidnapping was still news. She compared the image of young Luis to photographs she had found online of the man who matched her DNA. And what she saw convinced her that she was looking at the same person, separated by 73 years, thousands of miles, and a lifetime of unknowing. She went to the Oakland Police Department that same day. The Oakland Police Department did not immediately open the case. This is worth understanding without judgment. Investigators eventually agreed the new lead was substantial, and a new missing persons case was opened. The word eventually carries weight. Aliquin was not a law enforcement professional. She was a woman in her 60s, arriving at a police station with a photograph comparison and DNA test results, and a story about a 73-year-old kidnapping. It required the investigators to agree that what she had found was credible enough to act on. They agreed. And once they agreed, things began to move. Police reopened Albino's case. They searched through public records of the potential match and collected DNA samples from Albino's living siblings with help from the California Department of Justice and the FBI. The California Department of Justice. The FBI. This was no longer just a local cold case reopened on a hunch. This became a multi-agency investigation with real resources behind it. Police said investigators were unsuccessful in their multiple attempts to contact Albino and his family, and eventually were able to get FBI special agents dispatched to contact him at his residence. The FBI confirmed to NPR that it assisted Oakland police by our ability to access resources across state lines. And this is where things get quietly dramatic. Multiple attempts to contact him were unsuccessful. Was he avoiding them? Did he not understand what they were calling about? Or was this simply the logistical difficulty of reaching someone who had spent a lifetime at a distance from the name Luis Armando Albino? Whatever the reason, the initial contact attempts failed, and the FBI had to physically show up at his East Coast home. FBI agents at the door, asking questions about a 1,951 kidnapping in Oakland, California, about a woman with a bandana, about a little boy taken from a park, about a cross-country flight, about a family that had been searching for decades. What was that conversation like? We don't know. But what we know is that Luis Albino, now a man in his late 70s, agreed to speak with them, and he agreed to provide a DNA sample. The science is not complicated, but its significance cannot be overstated. FBI agents, at the behest of Oakland police, interviewed Albino at his home in the East Coast and took a DNA sample. His genetic material was a match to that of 2 surviving siblings in California, proving he was the boy taken in 1951, police said. 2 siblings, 2 living members of the Albino family still in California, their DNA compared to the sample taken at an East Coast residence, and the match came back positive. Not a 22% match, like the Ancestry database. A full, confirmed, biological sibling match. The DNA said what Alida Aliquin had believed since she first sat down at that microfilm reader in the Oakland Public Library. The man living on the East Coast was Luis Armando Albino. On the 20th of June, 2024, investigators drove to Aliquin's mother's home in Oakland. "We didn't start crying until after the investigators left," Aliquin said. "I grabbed my mom's hands and said, 'We found him.' I was ecstatic." They waited for the investigators to leave. They held themselves together long enough to hear the confirmation, to watch the officials walk back to their cars, to hear the front door close. And then, finally, in private, in the way that deep emotion sometimes waits for privacy, they let it out. 4 days later, on the 24th of June, 2024, Luis came to Oakland with members of his family and met with Aliquin, her mother, and other relatives. The next day, Aliquin drove her mother and her newfound uncle to Roger's home in Stanislaus County, California. Roger, the 10-year-old boy who had turned his back for one moment in 1951 and spent the rest of his life living with the weight of that moment. Roger, who had been interrogated over and over by investigators who pressed him to change his account and who never did. Roger, who was now an old man, living in Stanislaus County, who had carried his missing brother in his heart for 73 years. They grabbed each other and had a really tight, long hug. They sat down and just talked, she said, discussing the day of the kidnapping, their military service, and more. 2 old men, brothers, one who never stopped looking, and one who never knew he was lost. They talked about the day it happened. And they talked about their military service, because here is something that adds an extraordinary layer to the reunion. Both brothers had served. Roger and Luis, separated since childhood, had both ended up in the armed forces. They had that in common. 2 brothers, raised on opposite coasts, with no knowledge of each other, who had both walked the same path into military service. In my heart I knew it was him, and when I got the confirmation, I let out a big, "Yes!" Aliquin told the Mercury News. But before this story can be called fully resolved, several things need to be addressed. Because this is not a story with a clean ending. This is a story with a reunion, which is not the same thing. Antonia Albino did not live to see this day. Albino's mother, who died at the age of 92 inches, 2005, and kept a vigil of hope for her son, reportedly never stopped visiting the missing persons office of the police every year, believing he was alive somewhere. She died in 2005, carrying the newspaper clipping. She died having visited that police station annually, having made trips to Puerto Rico, having never stopped believing. And she was right. She was right all along. Her son was alive, but she never knew it. That knowledge, that the mother who searched her whole life died 19 years before the answer arrived, is something that cannot be neatly resolved. Aliquin said of her grandmother, "I think she's happy. Honestly, she was there guiding me too. It's just the way everything worked out. It's unbelievable." And Roger. The reunion happened. The brothers held each other. They talked. Luis came back again in July for a 3-week visit. It was the last time he saw Roger, who died in August. "I think he died happily," she said. "He was at peace with himself, knowing that his brother was found. I was just so happy I was able to do this for him and bring him closure and peace." Roger died 2 months after his brother came home, but he died knowing. After 73 years of not knowing, he died knowing. What remains unexplained in this case is significant and cannot be glossed over. The kidnapping investigation remains open. Oakland police said last week that the missing persons case is closed, but they and the FBI consider the kidnapping a still open investigation. Open. Because the who and the why and the how of 1,951 have not been answered. The woman who approached Luis at Jefferson Square Park has never been publicly named. The woman who kidnapped Albino, who had spoken to him in Spanish, reportedly flew him to the East Coast, where he was eventually raised by a couple who raised him as their own son. That woman has since died, family members said. She is dead, which means that whatever direct testimony she might have provided, whatever explanation she might have offered for why she walked into a park in West Oakland in 1951 and walked out with a 6-year-old child, is gone with her. But questions remain. Who was she? How did she know to approach Luis specifically in Spanish at that park on that day? Was she acting alone? Or was there a broader network, something more organized behind the abduction? Who was the couple that received Luis on the East Coast? Were they complicit in a kidnapping? Or were they told a different story about the child they were raising? It is unclear whether Albino was given a new name, whether the woman who raised him was the same person who took him from the park, and whether he was aware he had a family who was searching for him. These are not small questions. They go to the heart of what kind of crime this was, who was responsible, and whether those responsible can still be brought to accountability, even posthumously, even in historical record. There is a framework that investigators and researchers have considered when looking at cases like this one. In 1951, child trafficking networks did exist in the United States, though they were rarely prosecuted under that term. The deliberate targeting of a Spanish-speaking child who was new to the country, the speed of his removal from California, the fact that he was flown to the East Coast, these details suggest a degree of planning and resources that goes beyond an impulsive abduction by a lone, unstable individual. This does not mean the case fits any specific known trafficking pattern. The FBI has not made any public statement about what their ongoing investigation has found. But the systematic nature of what happened, targeted approach, language exploitation, immediate relocation across state lines, placement with a family, raises questions that have not been publicly answered. What is also notable is the timeline. In 1951, there was no Amber Alert system. There was no National Missing Persons database. There were no digital records, no surveillance cameras, no cell phone location data. A child who was moved quickly across state lines could, in that era, vanish with devastating completeness. Despite an enormous search for the missing child at the time, the trail went cold, and the case remained a painful mystery to the family for decades. The technology of the era was simply insufficient to the crime, and whoever took Luis Albino appears to have understood that. The role of DNA in this resolution cannot be overstated, and it points towards something that extends well beyond this one case. The technology that finally brought Luis Albino home did not exist in 1951. It did not exist in 1966, when the investigator said he would give anything to solve it. It did not exist in 2005, when Antonia Albino died still carrying that clipping. It existed in 2020, when Alida Aliquin sat down on what she described as a whim and took an ancestry test. The implications for other cold cases, for other families still waiting, still visiting police stations, still carrying newspaper clippings, are significant. Hundreds of thousands of children and juveniles are reported missing each year, according to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Not all of those cases will have outcomes like this one. But this case demonstrates with vivid clarity that the biological record is the genetic signature that every human being carries in every cell of their body is permanent, in a way that witness memories and paper trails and physical evidence are not. It cannot be destroyed, cannot be hidden, cannot be buried with the people who might have answered the questions. The DNA was always there, waiting. Now consider carefully what Luis Albino himself must be navigating. He is a man in his late 70s. He has lived an entire life. He has an identity, the one he was given, the one he built, the one his children and grandchildren know him by. He is a retired firefighter. He is a Marine veteran. He is a father, a grandfather. Those things are real. Those things are his. And now he has been told, confirmed, scientifically, irrefutably, that before all of that, he was someone else. That his name was Luis Armando Albino. That he was born in Puerto Rico. That he had a mother named Antonia who spent her entire life looking for him. That he had a brother named Roger who saw him disappear and never stopped knowing he had been there. Aliquin said her uncle did not want to talk to the media, and that although he had some memories of the kidnapping and his trip across the country, the adults in his life never answered his questions. He had questions. All his life, he had questions. And the people who could have answered them chose silence. So he lived in a silence, built by someone else's choices, constructed around him before he was old enough to fully understand what was missing. What does it feel like to be 79 years old and discover that the foundational story of your life, where you came from, who your parents were, why you were brought to the East Coast, was never... There is no psychological literature comprehensive enough to answer that fully. It is one of the more profound experiences a human being can have, and Luis Albino is moving through it in private, away from cameras and microphones, in the company of whatever support system he has built across 8 decades of living. His niece says he was grateful to be found. And the words he said to her, simple, direct, the words of a man who had lived long enough to know what mattered, tell you everything. He hugged me and said, "Thank you for finding me," and gave me a kiss on the cheek. Thank you for finding me. There is one more detail in this story that deserves its own quiet moment. The reunion, the DNA confirmation, the emotional meeting with Roger, all of that happened in June 2024. Luis went back to the East Coast, then returned in July for a 3-week visit. That July visit was the last time he and Roger were together. Roger Albino died in August 2024. The 10-year-old boy who watched his brother disappear from Jefferson Square Park in 1951 lived long enough to hold that brother again, 73 years later. He died 2 months after the reunion, and his niece, who made it happen, said something about that which is perhaps the most emotionally precise statement in this entire story. I think he died happily. He was at peace with himself, knowing that his brother was found. At peace. After 73 years. What remains? The FBI investigation is ongoing. The woman who took Luis from the park is dead. The couple who raised him on the East Coast has not been publicly identified. The full circumstances of how a 6-year-old child was transported across the United States in 1951, placed with another family, and kept hidden from the world for 7 decades. Those circumstances have not been fully disclosed to the public. There is a possibility that the investigation will eventually produce answers about who orchestrated the abduction and why. There is also a possibility that the passage of time, the death of the primary perpetrator, and the deliberate privacy maintained by Luis Albino himself will mean that some of those answers never fully surface. What can be said with certainty is this. A family in West Oakland carried a photograph and a newspaper clipping for 7 decades. A mother walked into a police station every year until she no longer could. A 10-year-old boy became an old man who never stopped knowing what he had seen. And a woman in her 60s took a DNA test on a Tuesday afternoon for no particular reason and found her uncle. The case is officially this. Luis Armando Albino, kidnapped at 6 years old in 1951, was found alive at 79 in 2024. The missing persons investigation is closed. The kidnapping investigation remains open. The questions that remain, who the woman was, how she did it, why she chose this particular child on this particular afternoon, are the questions that investigators are still pursuing. Whether those answers come, and when, and in what form, is something only time and the ongoing federal investigation will reveal. What this case teaches us about patience, about the refusal to accept a case as permanently closed is something that extends far beyond Luis Albino. I was always determined to find him. And who knows, with my story out there, it could help other families going through the same thing. Eloquent said. I would say, don't give up. Don't give up. That is the direct lesson of Alida Aloquin's 7-decade family pursuit. Not a government agency, not a funded investigation. A woman who grew up hearing about a missing uncle who took a DNA test on a whim, who watched a documentary that made her curious again, who went to a library and looked at microfilm, who walked into a police station and said, I think I found him. She did it because the family had never stopped believing the answer existed somewhere. They had never closed the case in their own hearts, even when every official resource had gone quiet. And in 2024, 73 years after, a woman with a bandana walked up to a small boy in a park in West Oakland and spoke to him in the language of home. The answer arrived. A retired firefighter, a Marine veteran, a grandfather, a man named Luis. He came back to Oakland. He sat with his brother. He talked about the day it happened. He embraced a niece he had never met and told her the only thing worth saying. Thank you for finding me. If this story moved you, and it should have, leave a comment below and tell me what part of this case stays with you most. Is it the mother who never gave up? Is it Roger, the 10-year-old boy who told the truth over and over and never stopped carrying it? Is it Luis himself who built an entire life and then discovered it had a hidden first chapter? Tell me. I read every comment. If you have a case you want me to investigate next, drop it below. There are stories like this one in every city, in every archive, in every family that is still waiting for an answer. Subscribe if you haven't already. Every week we go deeper into cases that deserve more attention than they get. Like this video if it gave you something to think about. Share it with someone who needs to hear that even after 73 years, there can still be an answer waiting. And to the families still searching, Alida Aloquin is right. Don't give up. The DNA is always there. The truth doesn't disappear. Sometimes it just takes longer to find.